stuff, and all we're really going to do is try and understand a bit more about birds and how they function. And one other thing I hope to do tonight, and that's to persuade you that birds as animals are really quite amazing things, and they're very different to other animals, insects and so on, obviously, that we see around. But also, we need to understand, first of all, that birds have feathers, and there are really no other creatures that we see today that are feathered in quite the same way. Although finding out more about dinosaurs these days that lived so long ago, we now know that these were the predecessors of birds, that they were around before birds, and birds evolved from them, and that they too sometimes had feathers. The feathers on birds are there to keep them warm, but they're also there to enable them to fly. Birds are extremely lightweight creatures, and if ever you've marvelled at birds of prey, birds like buzzards, which I'm sure you will see locally, soaring in the sky, eagles if you're up in Scotland, those birds need to be incredibly light to be able to stay up there. But they have lots of feathers on their bodies, and we'll see how many later on. And that enables them really to have a huge covering on their wings and keep them up. And this is a bird called a buzzard that we're actually looking at here. You're going to see one or two skeletons as well. We are looking at anatomy after all. But this rather lovely drawing that has been made on the right-hand side of the slide here was produced by a lady called Katrina van Grauw. She's a fine artist, and she allows me to use some of her really super work to use alongside my photographs. So that's a buzzard that's actually showing its flight feathers, the feathers on its wings, but no other feathers at all. What you can see is a structure of muscles there. Birds have lots of muscles that operate their wings, and they're called pectoral muscles. Look at these. Some men that build their muscles up. I'm quite pleased with those pectoral muscles there that operate these huge wings, and therefore all the feathers that you see. I mean, some birds cannot fly as well as buzzards, but we can look at those as well. Generally speaking, birds have good eyesight. Generally speaking, much better than ours. I mean, how often have you managed to get close to a bird, even if birds are fairly tame in your garden? They'll be off fairly quickly. But some birds need better eyesight than others, and this is a bird called a sparrowhawk. There will certainly be sparrowhawks around in Bushy Park, and if you put food out for birds in your garden, you will also have sparrowhawks coming through your garden quite frequently. So they need to be able to locate their prey and keep their eyes on their prey. And looking at this example, this is a female here, you'd think that her eyes were so big, they'd be pretty heavy, aren't they, the bird's eyes, that they might just quite simply pop out. But they're held by very strong muscles within those eye sockets. Interestingly, birds like sparrowhawks, and you may have seen birds like kestrels and the buzzards we just looked at, can actually move their eyes around as we can. But owls cannot. Owls have got even larger eyes, but their eyes are fixed in their heads for that very reason, that they're so large. It would be impossible for them to move them around. So your chairman just mentioned that, your president just mentioned that I'm a bird ringer. Well, I do study bird migration, and some of these migration routes that birds take that can be just quite amazing and almost unbelievable. And this is a little British bird called a red-necked phalarope. It's a little wader that can swim. They only breed up in the extreme north of Scotland and up in the Shetland Islands, and they're quite rare birds. They come as summer visitors, as many of our birds do, and at the moment they'll be on their way back to their wintering grounds. They'll have left the Shetland Islands. And I'm just going to pop a map up here now, a map of the world. And over on the right-hand side of the map, perhaps you can see a red star that I put on the map at the top of the Indian Ocean there. Well, we always assumed, and incidentally, there's Great Britain up there, where the arrow is pointing up towards Iceland, and that's where we thought they migrated to each winter. But now, as well as just putting rings on birds, which have individual numbers, which means if the birds are found, that then information can be collected. But these days we can put little transmitters on birds. In fact, we were fitting some just the other day. They're very expensive things. They can cost up to £3,000 each. However, we're learning an awful lot about birds and where they're going to. So instead of coming down to the Indian Ocean, we now realise that the route that our red-necked phalaropes take from the Shetland Islands follows the arrows that I'm just about to show you. There's one going up to Iceland there, The next arrow comes down to the tip of Greenland. The exact routes located on these birds, down to Newfoundland, across, over the Caribbean, out through somewhere like Costa Rica, and spending the winter off the coast of Peru. Now, we assumed that they were in the north end of the Indian Ocean because red-necked phalaropes from Norway and Sweden and Scandinavia go down that way, and we thought that ours probably went the same way, but they don't. They go the same way as all the American red-necked phalaropes. So perhaps there is a line between us and Europe, certainly as far as some bird migrants are concerned, and these are only tiny little birds. With this slide, we go back a long way, 150 million years, and we're looking at a fossil with some amazing detail on, and it's a bird, and it's called Archaeopteryx lithographica, and it's still reckoned to be the oldest fossil of a bird showing feathers. You can see the basic skeleton of the bird there, and it's not too much different, really, from the skeletons of birds we see today. Also, you can see the structure of feathers from those arm bones as we see in birds today. The big difference between Archaeopteryx and modern-day birds is that Archaeopteryx does not have a breastbone or a keel. Now, the keel is the anchor point for the flight muscles that I showed you earlier on. So Archaeopteryx would not have been able to fly very far. It could probably just hold out its wings, jump from one tree and glide to another. Modern-day birds can beat their wings, so they need strong flight muscles, a keel for an anchorage point. So things have changed since that time. However, the structure of the feathers and everything else you can see there is really very, very similar. So birds have been around for a long time. I was there showing a bird called a gannet diving into the sea. Gannets are very large seabirds. They have a 6-foot wingspan. And when they dive into the sea, they hit the sea at an enormous rate. So that can almost be bone shattering. So a bird's bones, certainly the neck muscles and the skull of gannets, is really very, very tough. And one other interesting little point to look at, we've got a close-up of a gannet's head here. You probably, if you're sitting away from the screen here, you won't quite see this, but a gannet's eyes are flat, absolutely flat on the surface. Most other birds have rounded eyes like ours, so that if we dive into a swimming pool to pick something up, I remember the days when I was at school, they used to throw bricks into the water and we used to have to dive down and pick them up. And it was always very difficult because of the refraction of light and underneath the water, and you put your hand down not quite in the right place to the brick. Well, in fact, the flat eyeballs of gannets ensures that there's no, the eyeball isn't changed or moved, and they can see everything exactly as they need to when it comes to catching fish. And another, it's a bird called a secretary bird, and this is an African species. And secretary birds, although they look rather like storks or herons with their long legs, they are actually birds of prey. They're related to the eagles. And they actually catch snakes and lizards, and they catch them with their feet. And as they don't want any of the soft parts of their body bitten by snakes, they can keep them well away from their bodies with their talons and holding them on their feet there. So here's a bird with very long legs. That shows up really clearly, of course, on the skeleton of the bird there. And we're back to sparrowhawks now, and here's a sparrowhawk that we saw before. There are the large eye sockets there, but long legs. It's actually caught something there. There's a skeleton of something in its talons there. But they've got very large feet and long arms to accommodate the wing feathers. And there we are. Look out for those in your garden. If you've got plenty of blue sits and grape sits coming on your peanuts or seeds, whatever you're putting out, you might very well see one of those coming and chasing the birds around. So some birds are very big and some birds are very small. The largest, certainly the heaviest British bird is the mute swan, and you'll all know these. A male mute swan can weigh 25 pounds. As birds go, that's a lot. I've ringed a few mute swans, and I can tell you they're heavy when you pick them up to ring them. So yes, and particularly the males. They always look nice when they're breeding in the spring, and of course when they've got their youngsters later on in the summer. I once found the remains of a mute swan. Its entire bone structure was there, nothing much was left. In fact, it was underneath some power lines. The poor bird had hit the power lines. It's actually broken an arm bone, a humerus. And it was on the ground, it was dead on the ground, that's all that was left. But I put that picture in to illustrate, to illustrate the sternum, the breastbone here. That was the anchorage point for the muscles. You imagine a bird weighing 25 pounds taking off. That takes a huge amount of energy. So the flight muscles are attached to the keel here. They're also attached to the inner arm bone, the humerus. Both very strong structures. But neither of them are solid. Their bones are actually hollow. That helps them again in being lightweight creatures. And in fact, the humerus that was broken in part of the same set is this one. And the break, of course, enables us to look inside the bone. We can see it's hollow, but you can see the structures in there, the struts that actually strengthen that hollow bone. So everything's been organised, everything's been well designed, and we're starting to see how birds work. Now, mute swans are huge, but some of the hummingbirds are really tiny. The one that I've illustrated with the photograph on the left is about the length of half of my thumb. It's a tiny little bird, but its basic structure, if you look across to the right-hand side there, is very much the same as many other birds, except that the keel, the anchorage point for the flight muscles, is really big. It's a major part of that bird's skeleton, and that's because hummingbirds need to fly pretty well continuously if they want to feed. If they perch, they won't be feeding. And they all have different shaped beaks, depending upon the flowers that are producing the nectar that species is adapted to feed on. The smallest British bird that we see, and you'll certainly see these and another close relative called the goldcrest in Bushy Park, is a bird called the firecrest. These are super little birds, and this is the time of year that we're ringing them. They're actually arriving in Britain for the winter from well across on the continent. When they arrive with us, they're weighing less than 5 grams. Tiny little birds. But again, the structure will be the same as larger birds. And here's another large bird for comparison. You probably know grey herons around the lakes and along the rivers. Big wings, long legs, and there's an example of the skull of a grey heron. There's not actually much room for brain there when you take the eyes out and the inner parts of the mouth. But birds operate well enough. They do everything they need to do to survive and to raise young. One wonders how much they think about it, but anyway, there we are. And grey heron again, showing the length of its neck. All mammals, I think I've got this right. Do we have 7 neck vertebrae? I think it's 7, yes, we have 7, and all other mammals do as well. But when we get into bird species, they will have long necks or short necks, and either more or less neck vertebrae. I could count those, I'm not sure how many there are there. But again, I know there's more than 20 on a mute swan. It'll be a bit less than that on this grey heron. And what about this for a close-up of a bird's claw? Well, all birds have claws. They need to hold on to perches and so on. Birds of prey need to kill their prey with their claws, but that's a grey heron's claw, and it has a very special design, and that is along this edge here, it's serrated. Can you see that comb-like structure along the edge of the claw there? Well, they use that as a comb. Grey herons catch fish, and the fish will flap about a bit when it's in the end of their beak, and fish scales and oil and mess from the fish will go over their plumage, usually over their heads and neck. Well, birds preen using their beaks to clean their plumage, but they can't preen their heads or their necks. So this bird has a claw with a comb on it to comb out the debris. And other water birds, including egrets, which you'll see locally around the lakes here, and nightjars and some of the owls also have, it's called a pectinated claw. But what about bird feathers? Because they also obviously come in a huge variety of sizes. The larger birds, like the eagles, could cover several goldcrests and firecrests with just one of their feathers. But the structure of the feathers always remains the same, and particularly the flight feathers. This is the feather of a mallard. If you see the mallards, the ducks, on the lakes, you'll know that both male and female, although they're different colours, have this lovely sharp coloration on their wings, again shown through iridescence. But as far as the shape of the feather is concerned, there's a main shaft from which the feather grows, and the feather grows out in tiny structures called barbs that knit together to form the whole web of the feather. These are downy feathers underneath here, which hold on to a certain amount of the bird's body heat. And they grow very quickly. I've written the growth rate in there. It can be between 3 and 6 millimetres a day in some small birds when their feathers are growing. It's really pretty quick. So this is what happens. The line along the bottom is the bird's skin. The little blobs are follicles through which the feather is going to grow. It first of all grows as a solid shaft under A and B, and as the shafts elongate, they're made of keratin, which is the same substance as our hair and our fingernails, and it's a dead structure when it gets to this stage, and it gradually peels off, so that gradually the structure of the feather bursts from the tube of keratin and eventually grows complete. This is all happening really quite quickly. So how many feathers do birds have? Well, that's another very tiny hummingbird called a snowcat. I won't ask you to shout out how many you think, but have a think about how many it might have. 100 feathers. That's quite a lot for a tiny thumb or half a thumb sized bird. So what about a swallow? These are summer visitors here. Most of us see swallows at some times during the summer. They're well on their way back to South Africa at the moment, by the way. They have a really long journey. They go down to the southern tip of Africa for the winter. How many feathers for a swallow? 1,100. Wow. That includes the long tail streamers that you can see there. And what about a thrush? This is the biggest of the thrushes we see, a rather grey bird called a missel thrush that always stands to attention when it's on the ground. That has 2,000. And then what about the mute swan that we keep talking about? 25,000. No. So there are the differences between individual birds. But the basic structures of those feathers are always the same. And we can divide those structured feathers into, fairly simply, 3 different areas. The feathers that I mentioned that are rather, are not fixed together, but they're loose structures, tend to be situated around the bird's body, and they help to keep the bird warm. It collects body heat, holds on to that body heat, and this is why in winter, if you're looking out into your garden, it's really cold and the robin's outside, it'll really look round, and it'll be rounded because it's opened up as far as it can, the outer structure of feathers, to get all this air moving around underneath that structure. Secondly, in fact, I think the names are coming up here. So that's called a down feather, D-O-W-N. The next feather on the top, there's a contour feather, and they're the feathers that grow all around the bird's body, over the down feathers. There's a bit of down underneath, but you can start to see the colour on the top. And all of those feathers grow one on top of the other, and through a tiled effect, the bird then is covered with colour and an outer layer of feathers. And these are the flight feathers here. These need to be very strong. They're the feathers on the bird's wing and on its tail that help to get the bird airborne, to keep it up in the air and to drive it through the air. And it will use those feathers as air brakes as well. So another picture of down feathers. They're all soft and gathering the warm air. And these birds are called eiders. They breed in the northern part of Britain. These are females, and they've got babies there. But if you notice, they're all smiling. They're really happy there. And the water temperature there is only just above freezing. It's in a lagoon in southeast Iceland, where the Vatnajökull glacier is breaking out into the sea, and it's extremely cold. But they're the conditions in which eiders breed, and they're able to do so because they've got these wonderful feathers situated around their bodies, so they're happy enough. You may also have seen young birds at times when youngsters first, like these barn owls, first hatch from the eggs. They're covered in down. Jolly good idea. They can maintain their body heat on their own very quickly. The interesting thing about young barn owls, they're all youngsters. They're all from the same brood in that picture. But they all hatch at different stages. There's always an old one, an older one in between, and then the young one, which is the one that's very down here. So this all works very well. That's proven. If you go down to the Antarctic, you can see the similar sort of thing here. These are king penguins. On the left is a youngster. That down is really thick. When we visit places like this, I've been into all sorts of wild, rare places around the world. And you're always asked, if you're on a particular reserve, not to touch the wildlife. You know, it's very tame and they'll walk up to you, but please don't touch it. But if I was to hug one of those young king penguins, I would disappear into mounds of feathers, and certainly they need it. The adults in the picture there show their outer feathers, which are highly waterproof. They spend so much time in the sea, and they will keep the weather out. And here's an example of a flight feather, in fact from a mute swan, with a very strong central shaft. The strength is in that shaft, and you can start to see, possibly you can see the individual barbs that link up, and I've got some more pictures to show you for that. Here we are, a bit more detail. You may see greenfinches in your garden, and that lovely yellow colour you see on the greenfinches is on their wings, and these are individual feathers here on the greenfinch's wing. You can see the central shafts, but look how the colour is placed just along that leading edge that shows up so clearly when we see the birds. That's the tail of a starling. Starlings are really quite attractive birds. They're not just black. And you can see the structure of these. The shaft is running, if you like, more through the centre of those tail feathers. But they're very strong. But now we're looking much more closely. This is a goose feather. And we're now looking at the shaft again. I'm sorry. We're now looking at the shaft again, running through the centre. But now we can see those individual barbs. Each one of those barbs is almost like a feather on its own, linking the others together. And even closer here on a tawny owl, here are the barbs. But from the barbs are growing things called barbules and barbicels. They've all got hooks on them, and they hook together. And when you see birds preening, that is because those barbs have sometimes become displaced on the twigs and the leaves and so on through which they're moving. And birds can pass their feathers through their bills, and that then links up the barbs again. It's rather like Velcro. It all joins together like pieces of Velcro. So that's very, very useful. Sorry, even better. There we are. There's the central shaft. There's a barb, barbules and barbicels linking together. And that's a contour feather. That's from a pheasant, a male pheasant from his back. Interesting there that looking at the downy part of the feather there, it's actually in two parts. This is very clever. If you wanted to design a bird and not use too much energy in your manufacture of that feather, why not make two feathers grow from one? And that's what's happened. One down feather is growing from the back of this one. So that's two layers in one, and that happens on several bird species. This picture actually shows the new feathers growing. You know, I described the feathers growing from the follicles earlier on. We had the diagram. But that's a baby stock dove. You'll almost certainly have stock doves nesting in holes in trees in the park here, rather attractive birds. And there it is, a big hairy bundle of feathers with new flight feathers and body feathers coming through. And there's your structure of feathers situated, actually. The feathers are situated on the back of the cock pheasant here. But you see how they overlap like the tiles on a roof. And that's the basic, simple structure of how birds are covered up. Now that's a bird we certainly mentioned 17 years ago, and that was tawny owls in Bushy Park. And I'm really pleased to hear they're still there despite the ring-necked parakeets. But they are structured in the same way as other birds. But owls fly silently. If you've ever been anywhere near owls, you will never hear their wings swishing around as you do on birds like pigeons and other birds. And that's because they have special structures to them. And they need them to move around silently. Now there we are, there's some detail from a tawny owl's feather. But along the leading edge of the feather, can you see the end of the barbs are sticking out individually here? That's even a closer view there. The idea there is that breaks up the movement of air over the front edge of the feather, and it therefore enables it to fly silently. If it's a sharp cut leading edge, you'd hear the swish that you can hear if you've been lucky enough to hear and see a mute swan taking off. You hear the swish of the feathers. That doesn't happen with owls. Why is that? A, because they can then approach their prey silently, because they're catching mice and voles. But also we now realise that owls use their hearing as much as their eyesight to locate their prey. So they don't want swishing sounds round their ears while they're searching for their prey. These all seem very simple answers, but they can be complicated. But anyway, I think it's the best way of expressing them. So owls have huge ears. It's also been shown now that barn owls, this one, can actually catch prey in total darkness without its eyes. Using its eyes, they can just use sound. And here, this is on a dead bird. I would not do this to a live bird. But what I've done, these feathers around the side of the face here, I've opened those up on this corpse, and that shows this huge ear and a big ear cavity. And they're situated on either side of the eyes. Massive ear structures. And they've even got special feathers there to protect the ear opening, little barb-like feathers. Birds eat in different ways. They consume their food and different types of food in many ways. Owls can actually swallow mice and voles whole. Their digestive system gets to work to remove the meat and everything it needs from those bones, but it doesn't pass the bones through in the normal way. They cough up the bones and hairs and the hair and the perhaps feathers if they're birds back up through their mouths. They produce what are called pellets. A number of other raptors and other birds do the same, and that's actually on the left there, a barn owl pellet, and the contents I'm showing you there have come from just one pellet. It's an enormous pellet, and you've got 4 short-tailed field vole skulls, and there are a lot more bones than that in that pellet as well. Now, certainly great crested grebes must nest on your lake in the park. These are very beautiful birds. Both male and female look alike, and we have a pair together here in the breeding season. The one on the left has a baby on its back. They carry their young on their backs to start with. And the bird here, which I think is the male, is giving the baby a feather. And the youngster will swallow the feather. That's because great crested grebes catch fish, swallow them whole. They don't cough up pellets with the bones in. The feathers enable the bones and other material to pass through the digestive system relatively easily. So there are many, many differences between species. This is what I'm trying to say. Now, also, birds spend a lot of time looking after their feathers, keeping their feathers in good condition. Because once a feather has grown, and I said it's produced from keratin, the feather dies. It's a dead structure. So that if it's broken, it can't be mended. The only thing that a bird can do is to replace those feathers. If they're badly damaged or pulled out, a new feather will automatically grow through the follicle. But if the feather is just broken at the tip, it then has to hold on to that feather until the next year, let's say, when it's going to molt. And every bird will molt, change its feathers completely every year for that reason. So they'll preen their feathers, they'll keep the barbs in good order. They'll also, particularly for water birds, they'll use an oil gland on their backs to spread over their feathers, to put some oil on their feathers to increase the ability to keep off water. Now this bird's got a long name, and it gives you an idea where I took this photograph. It's a Falkland Islands flightless steamer duck. At least I got that right. It's the only photograph I've got. I mean, if I'd got a mallard, I'd have put that in. But it's the only photograph I've got showing the preen gland. And that's it there. It's lifted its feathers up, it's rubbing its bill over the preen gland. Preen gland is producing oil, and it's spreading that oil over its feathers. The mallards in the park here will do exactly that. But that's the preen gland. Again, referring to your turkey, if you get one at Christmas, then you know the parson's nose? That is its preen gland. That's where the oil will be produced. Birds do like to bathe, and that's a collared dove. And that collared dove is quite simply not just bathing, but taking a shower. It's raining there, and it's got its wing lifted up there. It's getting as much water around its body to clean itself. You've all seen birds bathing in water. Some small birds even dust bathe to remove feather parasites. Birds have parasites around on their feathers. They have blood-sucking parasites around on their bodies, so they need to get those removed. And preening is therefore important. When we're ringing birds, those parasites sometimes move on to us, but they don't stay long with us. That's absolutely fine. They want to be back on birds. But anyway, this is a tiny bird, another small British bird, the wren. This is in my garden, and the wren is sunning itself there. First thing in the morning, it's been a cold night, and it's gathering in warmth underneath its feathers fairly quickly there. That's all working rather nicely. And here's a bird called a ptarmigan. I don't know whether you know about these. They nest on mountain tops in Scotland and then right up into and beyond the Arctic Circle. Scotland is one of the sort of more southerly places where they breed. And the amazing thing about ptarmigan is that they stay on the mountain tops in Scotland, above 2,000 feet, all year round. They breed there in the summer and they stay there in the winter after it has snowed. They've got very powerful feet for digging into the snow, and they feed on the shoots of willow trees. So up in the snow, they do need to be camouflaged because golden eagles will find them. So in the winter, they are white. And this is an example of a bird that molts several times each year, because that's how they look in the summer. They're now brown and grey to match in with their surroundings, where they're going to be quite vulnerable because they spend their time on the ground. So an example of a bird that molts several times. You've got to go across to India to find these birds as wild birds, but they are kept, of course, on estates here. And that's a peafowl, and that's the male with his tail spread. An example of an extremely colourful bird. Obviously, you couldn't get one better than that. Then we start putting some of our British birds up. Well, the robin doesn't do bad. It's not got such a choice of colours on it there, but it's really showing off there. So why are birds coloured? They do need to display. It's often the males that are more colourful than the females, and they quite simply display in the spring to attract females. But also they'll display to keep other males away from their females. So in other words, it's only the male birds that display. And at this point, it's only male birds that sing. So the nice sounds you hear from birds, I'm afraid, only come from the males. The females do not sing. And the reason is that the males and females need to mate. And if the females were singing, like the males, aggressively, which they would be, that just would not happen. So that's the reason why the females in birds aren't mutes. They can call, but they don't sing, and they won't display. This is a displaying robin, and he's really upset. He's really cross. You'll rarely see birds fighting, and the reason is that their display techniques are usually successful, and that stops that happening. And that's a young robin. Hasn't hatched out very long, hasn't left the nest very long, and you can just see that its red feathers are just beginning to show. As soon as the red feathers on a young bird come out completely, the adult male, its father, will chase it off away from the territory. So it works really well. But that then enables them to raise another brood very quickly. Now, I realise, and this is a mistake, I put this slide in, it's one I've used on Zoom, so people have actually been looking at their screens on this one, so we're not going to spend long on it. But how are colours made up? Well, I've mentioned pigments, and I've also mentioned light being used. Well, when you think about it, colour is light, and we wouldn't see colour without light. If all the lights went out here, you wouldn't see any of the coloured clothing that we're all wearing. And the light is made up to produce a whole range of colours through a spectrum. Can you see the spectrum running through the picture there? Well, birds see the same spectrum as we do. We see through three basic colours to make those colours up. Birds see a fourth colourway, and that is ultraviolet. We do not see through ultraviolet. This means that birds see as we do, but with a fourth sense, if you like, another sense to see just that much more. That's what that slide is saying. And that's very useful. Insects also see through ultraviolet, the same as birds do. Mammals do not. We do not. So how is it used? Well, the eye structure of birds is slightly different, and the cones at the back of the eye pick up a whole range of different light senses. And that was only discovered in the 1970s. So that's only 50 years ago that we first realised that birds and insects see through ultraviolet. So
That's something we've learned fairly recently. Now, colours can be shown on birds, which I've already said, through pigments, through pigmentary colours, which I'll explain in a moment, or structural colours. That's the tail of a magpie, and we're seeing the blues there because of the structure of the feathers. That means that light is bouncing and moving through those feathers, being absorbed and thrown back again, and that's how we see iridescent colours. A bit more on that in a moment. So what about the pigmentary colours? They come in a number of different ways. Now the reds, the oranges and yellows, so the red on the face of a goldfinch, are shown through pigments called carotenoids. And they produce the red and the yellow colours. And they can be placed around the feathers, around the bird's body, wherever it needs them. And carotenoid pigments are ingested through the bird's food. It's what the bird eats that actually produces these colours, and it's moved through the circulatory system and deposited wherever it's necessary. So fairly quickly on this one. Another type of pigment is melanin. All of the colours on our body, our hair, our fingernails, our skin is shown through melanin pigments. And I'm afraid these are rather dull sort of pigments, and we haven't got the bright reds and yellows and oranges. So lots of the brown birds like tiny little wrens, have pigments made up through melanins. Some of the darker colours. Melanins are manufactured in the bird's body from proteins called amino acids. So they're produced in a different way to the carotenoid pigments. A lot of the birds that need camouflage are brown and grey. That's a pheasant on its nest in amongst the leaves on the floor, on the woodland floor. Very difficult to see her there. That's her head there. That's her eye and her beak. The wings are here, and the tail is there. She's even buried herself underneath there. So melanistic pigments are really good for camouflage. There are other colours that are made through porphyrins, strange greens and browns and deep reds, as you can see on the parrot there. And then it comes to iridescent coloration, and they produce these lovely purples, greens and blues that we see on a range of birds. But this requires light to bounce into the feathers, to bounce off the feathers, to be absorbed by the feathers and then thrown out. And this is all light structured. So the lovely colour we saw on the wings of a mallard earlier on, made up in that way. It really does need light to show that. And here's some other ducks that you'll see again in the park in the winter called teal, beautiful colourful little males here. And look at the teal flying there. Now in the books, in the bird books, the teal will be shown with green flashes on their wings. So there, the green flashes, that one's green and that one's blue. That's because, if they were pigments, they'd all look green. But that's because of iridescence and the fact that bird, the bird at the bottom there, has its wing turned up, so the light is shining from a completely different angle to produce that different light on the feathers. That helps to explain how these colours are shown. Lovely picture of a starling, showing some iridescent colours on its plumage there. Adult starlings from about February onwards, have bright yellow beaks. Now, if you look at your starlings, if you do see them in the garden or around town, they have black beaks during the winter, but yellow in the spring. It helps to display and to breed. And that's a male starling, and if you look at the base of the beak, can you see that as pale blue? On a female, it will be pink. So if you remember blue for boys and pink for girls, different bill colours on starlings, which helps them to recognise each other. And another really good example here of iridescent coloration is on our magnificent hummingbird again. The bird has turned its head, the sun is not shining on its bib or on its head. When it turns the other way, the sun picks up those fantastic colours. So think about that when you're out watching your birds in the park. The colours are shown in lots of different ways. Blues are also colours made up structurally, a bit different to iridescence, but that's a bit complicated. and the kingfishers show those beautiful colours, of course. And white on birds' feathers means that it lacks pigment and it lacks any feather structures to produce light, colour from light. So we see this on the gulls and so on. Very, very, very simply shown there. But birds don't just have colours on their feathers, they might have coloured beaks. We saw the yellow beak on the starling, but how about if you're a keel-billed toucan in a Costa Rican rainforest and you want to show yourself off? That's really very splendid on that enormous beak. And what about going to Galapagos and seeing blue-footed boobies? Well, there we are. These are structured in the same way as on birds' feathers. And also, if you're down in Galapagos as well, the frigate birds with their bright red gular pouch. They actually inflate that balloon, only the males have it. They inflate this and it blows around in the wind. And that's how they attract their females. And just one last thing to mention here, this is a little bird that nests in reed beds here in the summer, a sedge warbler. Well, that's a little brown bird, a little grey bird. When they're singing to display, I mentioned the males singing, they can also show themselves off through those lovely bright carotenoid colours inside their gate. And I'll leave you with this one. During lockdown, I lived in a village on the coast, so we were very fortunate. We're on the South Downs, not far from Dover. So it meant that we could walk from home. I perhaps walked for a bit longer than half an hour to start with. But I was able to catch up with lots of photography during that time and to photograph some of the common birds that we see around us. These are birds called whitethroats. They weren't all singing together, but I was so pleased with all those 3 pictures I put them to see. I hope that wasn't too complicated. No, I don't think so. So I think you might see birds in a different light to the way you did before. Thank you.